everyone, it is Christy, it is Sunday, welcome to Weekend Winters. I hope you guys are all doing well. I'm running a little bit late, so if I'm a bit scattered, my apologies, but I hope it is great wherever it is, whenever it is you are. Hello to Striped Mongoose and the Lucky Wanderer in the chat. Hope you are both doing well. I am surviving this heat wave. Hope you guys are also. Anyone else who has got a heat wave going on, again, you know, Northern Hemisphere bias, hope you are doing well. Last time we talked about the political compass test. We took a look at it. I went ahead and I told you I'm running a bit behind. I gotta puff up my back bit here. I like this chair, but I like to sit a bit more forward, so I get my little bit stuffing in there to help out. Yeah, so last time we looked at the political compass test, and the other thing there are a lot of critiques. I had a lot of critiques about it, and the thing that I mentioned last time was that it might be interesting to think about the challenge of creating, the usefulness of the left-right scale, what some of the context and other things that you have to take into consideration. And so for this episode, I am going to be looking a little more broadly at the concept of measurement in political science in particular, and not just political science, but the social sciences in general. What are the challenges that we face as political scientists or social scientists, sociologists, psychologists, social psychologists, anyone who studies human beings and their behaviors have a challenge. And I want to talk a little bit about why. That was mostly what I wanted to do for the show. I've got a couple things to read out. We'll look at some metrics, some measurements of left-right, and to look at some of the ways that people have tried to quantify this concept in the past, and also the challenges that we face with it. So first, can I just say hi? I want to make sure people in the chats can hear. I see there are 11 of you watching now. Hello. So yes, hi. It seems like my sound is going. This thing is going. It looks like everything is going well. So if you want to give me a little bit of feedback, that'd be great. But I guess if you couldn't hear me, you would have already said something by now. Right, I will go ahead and change over the screen to the one I had prepared. This is the one I had prepared. And sadly, like with PowerPoint, there isn't so much you can do to kind of make it look any better, but maybe I can zoom in a little bit more. When I was preparing for this show, I realized that, okay, thank you, Eva, and hello. I realized that this isn't a lecture, you know, like you guys aren't paying tuition. I haven't created a syllabus and a reading list and done 8 hours of background research for 1 hour of show. I'm gonna just kind of riff a little bit. Oh, glad to hear all is well, a Lucky Wanderer. Glad to hear that. I'm just gonna kind of riff a little bit about things that I know about and organize my thoughts in a way that I hope will be interesting to you. When I was preparing for the show, I realized that the way that I could organize this discussion in a very kind of basic way was simply the questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how. It actually is a very convenient way to think about the challenges that we face when trying to measure something like left-right as social scientists. So when I wrote them down, I realized that I could kind of break them down into two different sections. And here I am, I'm like editing on the fly while I also, that's what I wanted. Come on, can I do the font thingy again here? No, all right. Design, insert, home. I think home is what I want, yeah. 44 font is a little too big, let's go 40. And that should fit everything on the screen. Reading comments, listening along makes it easier. Okay. So when I realized, I was kind of thinking, how can I organize this? And I realized that using the who, what, where, when, why structure allows me to break it up into two parts. The first part is the part about social scientists. And I'm not saying this is comprehensive. You can think about why and how and what in other ways. But why we measure, what we measure, and how we measure are a good framework to think about the challenge that we face as social scientists when it comes to trying to understand the social constructs that human beings operate, the social world. our social realities, everybody else's social realities. And then when it comes to the things that will affect or change or not allow us to standardize, our questions include: who are we measuring? When are we measuring? And where are we measuring? So that has to do with the populations of interest. And I thought I would take these in turn, starting with the challenges that we face as political scientists or social scientists. Coming to the question of why. Why do we measure things? Why is there a left-right scale? Why is there, a 7-point left-right scale, or a 5-point left-right scale, or an 11-point left-right scale? Ultimately, the reason why we measure is that we want to try to understand why people do what they do. And that sounds pretty obvious, but then it comes to the issue of when we measure, why we're measuring these things in order to get an explanation. But that brings up a philosophy of social science question. What does it mean to have an explanation? So we can kind of do things as social scientists in two time periods. We can either take data from the past and take the things that we've measured and use the variables that we've measured to see how much explanation of the phenomenon we are able to account for. So just a little bit of how things operate in the world of social science. Whether it's psychology or sociology or political science, there are different methods depending on the size of the population. So in psychology, they have different ways of evaluating these things than in the sociology or political science, where we tend to deal with survey data. We look at people in the aggregate. But let's say we have something like the American National Election Study. We have a bunch of things that we think allow us to understand vote choice. And so we ask people questions about things we think will explain their vote choice. And let's say, ideally, it's kind of hard to, it's harder to do this with a probability, like a vote, not vote, because the explanations are a little bit more complicated. So I'm gonna, let's say that we want to, sorry, wow, how am I, I think it's because I don't talk in the morning. I need to talk to myself for half an hour before I come on air. Hey, Pandinus Rex, good to see you. And yeah, watch this later and hope you enjoy it. Hey, Trans Gamer Girl. Mwah. Kisses to you. All right. I think that was the frog in my throat. Gone now. Apologies. Let's say we want to explain where somebody puts themselves on a left-right scale. So we have a 7-point scale, with 1 being as far left as you can go, and 7 being as far right as you can go, and then in the middle you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We want to try to predict where someone is going to place themselves on that. We want to try to understand what things go into it. So the most obvious thing that we want to control for when it comes to people are their socio-demographics, their age, their income, their education, and maybe where they live in the country. There are things about people that are sort of independent of, you can't help aging. Everybody ages. And there are things about your geography that might account for your attitudes that you aren't conscious of. Because if you live in London, let's say, and it's a very cosmopolitan city, you're very accustomed to interacting with a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds. Your job requires you to have that kind of skill set to be able to adapt to different people's backgrounds. That will be something that you're not necessarily consciously aware of, but will have an influence on you. And that might be different from someone who lives in a very rural area and in a very small town that's very homogenous. So we try to account for various things about people's socio-demographics, and then we might have other questions too. At the end of the day, we would want to be able to say, when somebody varies on left-right, let's say people tend to move farther to the right according to our data, for every 10 years older you are, you move one more point or half a point farther to the right. We would predict that people get more conservative as they age. And people who are younger are going to be more left-wing. Now, that's not true for everybody, but in our population, we're able to use math to say that in this group of people, for every 10 years older you are, we would predict that from 10 years previous, you would move yourself a little bit farther to the right. Now, is that an explanation? I mean, yeah, but what you're basically saying is that aging is an effect, but you're not, I mean, is it explaining left and right? From a political science point of view, you are, because you want to predict where people are going to place themselves. So you can look at your self-identification in terms of your gender identity. And traditionally, people who are like, let's say cis men, because that's generally who gets measured, are politically farther to the right than cis women, who also typically get measured. So we would predict, if we knew that your age, your identity, your gender identity, your education, your income, we could use a formula and estimate how many points left or right these independent variables would be able to explain or predict, but explain, like if you say that you're a 2.2, we should be able to, with our little estimate, say, okay, well, for the effective age, you'd move right, but for the effective being a cis woman, you'd move left, and then for the effective education, maybe you move left, and for the effect of your geography, you'd move right, and so you add it up and subtract it, and you'd get a number. Maybe it's like 3.4. But the respondent that you're looking at is 2.2. So you're able to account for a large amount of, you'll be able to predict generally what side of the left-right scale they're on. And you're kind of far off, but you're not as far off as you could be, if that makes sense. That's what we aim to do. We're looking to be able to do that kind of quantification. But that means our measures are really set up for ourselves. Our measures are designed to help us understand the world through mathematics. It's not necessarily designed for people and their realities, because the way that we think about the world as social scientists is we like to have very clear categories. We don't like people to sort of like, have more than one category. Either you live in the north or the south, and so we'll put you in one or the other. You're in this cohort or you're in that cohort, and there's a little bit of flexibility in that. You can organize people by, let's say, under 50 and over 50, or you can do it by decade, or you can do it by age and years, depending how granulated you want to get. But in terms of like these attitude measures, we tend to think about the ways that those measures best benefit our analysis. And so that is the perspective we're coming from as political scientists. Are these measures valid? Like, do they measure what we think they're measuring? And are they able to do a good job in our models? So if it performs well in our models, we kind of assume if we can predict something, we've sort of explained it. Now, this gets into a pretty philosophically deep debate. Is prediction explanation? And philosophically, no. Let me give you the logic of this. From the perspective of like the physical sciences, I think this is where a lot of this comes from. Again, the social sciences are like they aspire to be as clear and quantified and precise as the physical sciences, but the social sciences just aren't, because human beings are fuzzy in their behaviors. But if I predict something, have I explained it? I mean, clearly there is a link here between prediction and explanation. They're both kind of different, but at the same time, one can see a compelling case that could be made. If I can use 3 variables and I can predict something, let's say 100% certainty, like I can predict 100% certainty what the outcome is going to be, clearly I have an understanding of factors that are important to be able to provide an accurate prediction. And this is where we kind of get into the problem with polling, right? And polling elections. People talk about polls now, and then let's say in November, after a whole bunch of events, they'll say, oh, the polls were wrong. Like, well, you're measuring something in August for something that's going to happen in November, and there's a lot of time there. But let's say you had a polling outfit, some kind of polling company, and they did a whole bunch of calculations, and did all their variables, and they gave exactly what the popular vote was going to be. They gave exactly what every electoral college outcome was going to be, and they predicted the total for each candidate perfectly. Have they explained the election? Have they explained the important factors that went into the election? Again, yes and no. I mean, there's a power in prediction that tells you that the measures you're using and the theories you're using are helping you understand the phenomenon. On the other hand, simply being able to predict something accurately does not necessarily mean it will, especially in the social sciences, be able to always do that sort of level of prediction to that level of accuracy in the future. So explanation, we tend to mean by that how much of the variance in an outcome can we account for. So why we measure and what we measure and how we measure is really designed for us, and for our purposes, our needs, our perspective as social scientists. Those, though, they become what people think about in the public sphere. People outside of political science hear these things. They hear left-right spectrum. They see it reinforced over and over again in the media. They are asked about it in survey questions. They're asked to place themselves on a left-right spectrum or whatever else. And then it becomes a sort of like a notion in public consciousness. But as we'll see, left-right, although convenient for us and perhaps helpful for us as social scientists, doesn't always fit in terms of people's lived reality, because you can put someone on a scale somewhere. Does that mean you've explained to them? And so I don't want to say there's a left-right, I'm sorry, I don't want to say that there are answers to these questions. These are things philosophically, statistically, conceptually that we wrestle with, and especially with the fact that we're constantly moving, we're measuring a moving target. So why we measure is to provide ourselves with explanations. That's why we measure. What we measure. Okay, before that, I will take a little break and look in the chat and see what you guys are saying in there to see if it sounds like an R-squared versus R-squared values. So correlation versus the amount of explanation. Yeah, and this is when you're saying like when things correlate versus when you can actually account for the variance in your dependent variable. But even if you're accounting for the variance in your dependent variable, you could put other variables in the model and not get as good a result. So then you're comparing R-squared. I don't want to go down that road too much, but I think it's good for us to keep our humility as social scientists. I think it's good for us to realize that we're not speaking truth, that we're in some ways reflecting data and constructing explanations, and that we have we have some standards, we have some conventions and practices, but it's the ground that we're on isn't as firm as we think, especially when we come to a metric like left and right. It's pretty squishy, as we'll see. Conservatives rile people about social progress. They're selling poor forms of capitalism. This economic, I remember seeing this graph of British Party economic policies and social policies against people's general beliefs, and people's economic beliefs were closer to the Labour Party policies, but closer to the Tories' social policies. Yeah, people are complicated, and people often hold contradictory beliefs about, within the same ideological, I'm pro-life, but I'm also pro-death penalty. And in their mind, that makes sense, but you're like, but it doesn't. Hey, Lonely Wolf. The PowerPoint isn't that exciting. I just wanted to give people a visual reference to kind of follow along where we were. So what is it when we measure left-right? What are we measuring? This is probably the hardest question about measuring left-right. It's not that difficult to measure age in years. we can define age in years in a way that is pretty intuitive and understandable and plausible. So it could be, the year you were born subtracted from the year you took the survey. Now, like when you have your birthday in there might be a little bit of a gray area, but you're going to get generally the right age in years. When it comes to measuring left and right, from what I looked up, left and right really emerged out of the French Revolution as a concept, because when they organized the seating in whatever, in the French version of whatever, they had people who were like on the aristocracy on one side, or before the revolution, or during the like build up to it, and then the sort of commoners were on the left side, and therefore the people who were more radical were on the left, and people who were more reactionary were on the right, and this became a sort of default political orientation as to it's a heuristic, and by heuristic I mean it's a mental shortcut to get you to a bigger concept. So we're kind of stuck with left and right now, and in some cases it makes sense. When we look to measure the world, it's helpful to have a spectrum with poles of extremes on either side. This is a good thing for our measurement. It helps us to be able to have clear ends to the poles, the extremes of our spectrum, and then we can kind of divvy up the middle part into steps from less to more. The question is, does it make sense? All right, so if we have, let's say, a strongly agree to strongly disagree on a single topic, such as support for the death penalty. Let's say you were given a survey question. It says, do you agree with the following statement? The state should never have my country should not have the death penalty. And you give someone a strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, and strongly disagree. Now from there, you've got a clear one topic. How do I feel about the death penalty? Am I for it or against it? It's very simple. It's just, it's not a very complicated question. And you have not only a direction for the amount of support, agree and disagree, but you also have an intensity. What does intensity allow you to do as a political scientist or a social scientist in general? It kind of is it's an intensity measure. It allows you to see where people are very polarized. So if you have a population, you look at a survey, and the question is, the country should not have the death penalty, and most people are in the middle, right? Most people are either neither agree nor disagree, or disagree. You've got this sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for? I know this is a bivariate, but you've got sort of a bell curve, or a normal curve, where you've got some people on the extremes, but most people are in the middle. You would imagine then, you could infer from this, that in this population, the death penalty is not a very intense topic on which a lot of people are disagreeing. It's not a polarizing issue. It is an issue where people have opinions, but it's not necessarily one where you're getting a lot of disagreement within the population on it. Whereas, let's imagine that same question, strongly agree to strongly disagree, and you have half the population in strongly agree and half the population in strongly disagree, and pretty much nobody in the middle. This intensity would give me I would infer from this that this is a pretty hot topic, that this is something that's very polarizing. So the issue of even having strongly agree or strongly disagree on a question, is it really even useful? Should you just have it, I agree with the death penalty, I don't agree with the death penalty? I don't know. Is there any difference between somebody responding to that 3-response question versus putting themselves on a left, on a strongly agree to strongly disagree spectrum? What is the empirical and measurement value of asking people to do that? And we call it a Likert scale or a Likert scale for the strongly agree to strongly disagree. It's basically a 5-point scale where 3 is in the middle. Oftentimes, social scientists aren't as reflective. I mean, we're stuck with replicating other people's questions in order to be comparable, directly comparable with questions that were worded in that way in the past. But empirically, when I come to measure that on a model, if someone agrees with the death penalty versus strongly agrees with the death penalty, that is going to create a difference in the result, the coefficient, right? And so what does that mean interpretation-wise? That somebody strongly agrees versus just agrees. And again, I'm kind of getting into like, I'm making this sound really complicated because it is. It's really mushy what we do. So I'm setting up this whole issue about strongly agreeing or strongly disagreeing or just agree and disagree with the death penalty because I want to compare it to what we do with the spectrum for left and right. Okay, so agree or disagree on the death penalty is a pretty straightforward yes, no, on, off, or I don't have an opinion, right? I don't know, or I can see both sides, I'm really torn. You can have those people too. But it's an on-off switch. You're kind of on a single dimension. So thinking about that, now let's look at something like a left-right spectrum. A left-right spectrum isn't as clear as a yes-no on the death penalty, right? Because it's not saying left or not left, right or not right. It's saying there is a left and there is a right, and you are somewhere in the middle. So the extremes, the poles there, like the points on the end of your spectrum aren't on necessarily the same dimension, if that makes sense. So a common scale that is used is, let's say, laissez-faire versus socialist. Well, is it possible to be not laissez-faire but also not socialist? Can you have criticisms and have critiques of a capitalist approach without necessarily adopting all the views of socialism? And so when we put these scales, these left-right scales together, what we're doing is we're assuming that people, that just like there's a yes-no to the death penalty, we're assuming that the opposite of capitalism is socialism. And if you're not a capitalist, you're a socialist. But is that right? Is that correct? Is that the best way to measure it? And should we really be putting these two things together? Or should we have a capitalist, not capitalist, socialist, not socialist sort of scale and decouple these? So I'm going to read the chat now because I do want to interact with you guys. And I could natter on about this stuff forever, but I hope I'm making it fuzzy for you. That's my goal is to put ambiguity into your mind, and that's not to doubt the measures or say that they're completely useless, but it is complicated. So trans gamer girl. Yep, it also doesn't help that my mom fell for the propaganda with the EU as the source of all the problems in this country. People like simplistic answers. That's true. People have complicated lives, and things that are complicated are hard and require a lot of work. So, hi, Kevin. I see you. Oh yeah, you aren't a mod. Why are you not a mod in my thing? I actually couldn't add you. There you go. Now you're a mod. I hope that's really you. Otherwise, I just modded somebody impersonating you. All right. So since you drove up all the comments up, I have to go higher up. Lonely Wolf. It's complicated because I can reach the same conclusion as a left-wing person, but my reasoning in my mind has a conservative taste. Having an answer doesn't tell you how people got to that answer. And yeah, two people can come to the same kind of view in two different ways. So yeah, like I said, human beings, super complicated. My mom seems to have gotten more left-wing. City Life, can I ask if you are in the United States? Because I have a theory that Donald Trump has actually, you know how has pushed people to the left. If you remember back in 2015, Sargon and everybody in the YouTube bubble just kept saying, people who are social justice warriors are pushing people to the right. We're pushing people to the right. We're pushing people to the right. And left-wingers have not done the same. This is probably a problem with our framing. I'm just going to go on a tangent here, right? Left-wing people are more interested in crapping on their... It just seems to me like there's a lot of personal virtue signaling on the left, where they have to disambiguate themselves from left-wing politicians who aren't perfect by saying, so-and-so is crap, but... And And that takes up the space that, the right wing would look to a left wing person and say, you're pushing people to the right. And left wing people, instead of looking at Trump and Trump supporters and saying, you guys are pushing people to the left, we spend more time crapping on our own politicians. And we are missing, I think, a huge social phenomenon, which is that Trump, because he is being openly racist, because he's been so long openly sexist and disgustingly so, there are a lot of white people who are finally seeing what people like me and people of color have been seeing about the Republican Party for a long time. Nicole Wallace, Rick Wilson, David Frum, Stuart Stevens, all of these bourgeois, white, well-to-do, well-meaning conservatives thinking that they are good people and thinking that their party, the party they were in, wasn't racist because they didn't experience the racism that their party was organizing. Their white privilege protected them. Finally, with Trump saying the quiet part out loud, those people realize they're finally seeing what we've been seeing for decades. That the Republican Party is still the party, has become the party of the KKK. It is the party of Jim Crow. It is the party of disenfranchisement, and it's anti-democratic. It openly courts racists. It has no problem with any kind of discrimination or sexism. What they want is power. And those white people are finally waking up. And Trump has forced them to be anti-racist, which means he's moved them to the left. Trump has forced them to be anti-sexist, which is pushing them to the left. And even though people like, I'm sure, Nicole Wallace and Stuart Stevens and other people who are part of the Never Trumper movement, they haven't changed their mind on abortion. They haven't changed their mind on death penalty. They haven't changed their mind generally on the principles of how the role of government in people's lives. On a lot of identity politics issues, they have shifted far to the left. Not only do they now sort of empathize with Black Lives Matter, they are defending Black Lives Matter. And so we miss a trick on the left because we spend so much time in self-sabotage. We don't have a coordinated attack on people like Sargon and Tim Pool and others saying, you guys are moving people to the left. You're the reason why Never Trumpers exist. You are the reason people are voting for Biden the way that they did for us. And this is a whole problem I have with messaging. So anyway, I'm sorry, I just went off on a tangent there. So, all of that off of, of City Life saying your mom seems to have gotten left wing. All right, so TAZ says, but if more people move to the polarized end, the end becomes the new standard, the tip of the curve, and pushes the limits even further. I don't really. Okay, so therefore this approach is only valid in stable, slow-paced, changing societies, which none of the current Western societies are. I think you can just have people at an extreme. I don't think that. So when it comes to, let's say you have a left-right scale that's far right, right, neither left nor right, left, and far left. Creating a 7-point scale for that doesn't really actually make the far left any more extreme. All it does is it gives people another option in the middle to place themselves. They give should they put themselves closer to the far left or closer to the center. But because even far left is up to the interpretation of the respondent, what you're doing is you're measuring people's perception of far left and far right in that time period. And that time period, those definitions can change over time, but the measure kind of stays the same. You have to understand the context of the left and right there. So you're assuming that there is an objective political extreme, or an objective, maybe I'm misrepresenting you here, but what it sounds like you're saying is there's an objective left-right spectrum, and that somehow our metrics are sliding left and right on here. Where the fact is that when we think about the left-right spectrum, we think about the entire spectrum, and we're asking people to self-place somewhere either more right or more left. But let's say, that there's a whole big left-wing extremist environmental movement. how are we going to change our measures to reflect that left-wingness versus before it existed? You really don't, because you just have the left-right spectrum, right? So you just have to understand that in that time period, those measures, when people were thinking about those, were probably thinking about whether or not they identify with that extreme left-wing environmentalist movement and incorporate that into your understanding. But the left-right metric, just the wording and the numbers, we don't adjust those in any meaningful way. It comes down to interpretation. And that's why when it comes to the political compass test, for me, it's quite meaningless to ask people these questions if you don't know what country they live in. Because the left-right spectrum of, let's say, religious values should be instilled in schools is going to be quite different from an American perspective than someplace where there's a theocracy and people answer in a way that they think the survey respondents, want to hear it or whatever else. So I think there's a real problem with dumping, especially Western values and Western assumptions and concepts into a global survey and then just treating all the answers as if they were the same. Because the metric doesn't change. The metrics will stay the same. And expanding it to an 11-point scale doesn't mean people will think that the extreme is more extreme. They'll think about the polls in terms of what their lived experiences are and what they think it is. So that's my take on it. You're free to disagree, of course, but after having thought about this, that's kind of my take. How much can a response bias also be part of it, where we make our choices based on what we assume the in-group should believe rather than what we actually believe? That's also true. What we find in the social sciences is there does seem to be evidence empirically that people are more likely to give what we would predict to be the socially undesirable view in anonymous surveys versus when you talk to a real person. So if people are part of a YouGov panel or an Ipsos Mori panel or a Gallup or a Pew Poll panel, sorry, and they feel like they're giving an anonymous opinion, they will it's more likely that they'll give a less socially desirable one than if you compare the exact same response rates and the distribution of the responses in a in-person or like if you've got somebody who actually comes to your door and does a survey at your door. So there is also, some part of that social scientists are aware of, and we know that response bias or social desirability bias is a problem, and so we try to avoid that, one, through the mode of delivery, but we can't always control the mode, so we also try to look for ways when we word the question to word it in a way that doesn't prime people for one response or another. And if you remember, there were some questions in the political compass that I said had normative assumptions. They were making value judgments in the wording of the question, and that then is very leading in terms of how people will respond to it. But response bias both in terms of social desirability and also the form in which the interviewer or the response was given is something that is, it's nothing you can't fix entirely. And I guess, sorry, the most powerful evidence that people are willing to tell the truth or to be more honest when they feel that their answers are anonymous is Joe Twyman over at YouGov gave this example multiple times when he would give talks. At YouGov they did someone wanted to do a survey about sexual fantasies. They wanted to go online and get a sample of the panel from, because YouGov has, I'm sure, well over 600,000 at this point. This was years ago. But they have a whole bunch of people that are part of their panel, and they recruit from different parts of the population in order to get a group of people that has representation that looks like Britain. So they're trying to get from older demographics, younger demographics, people with less education, people with more education. It's easy to get people with lots of education to participate in these kinds of surveys. So they recruit from very hard to reach populations. And that way, when they have responses, they can pull people in these different demographics in order to get you a sample that looks like a sample you would get on the phone if you just did it randomly. They did their sample, and the people at YouGov were just like, I don't think this is going to work, because what the researcher wanted to do was just say, do you have sexual fantasies? Would you be willing to tell me about your sexual fantasy? And then just sort of like leave a text box. And they were like, oh, we don't really think people would be willing to do that online. We don't think people would be willing to just talk about their sexual fantasies in such an open way. Boy, were they wrong. In the beginning, people said this is anonymous, it won't be traced, nothing will be attributed to you, but we would like to know what kind of sexual fantasies you have. And there were like people just, some people opened up, and maybe there's a slight exhibitionist, but it seemed to be pretty wide in the sample. So I don't know where I was going with it. Was that about bias? Something like that. All right. The left tends to focus on ideology while the right tends to focus more on effective power. I would unfortunately agree with that. I think that there is people on the left, so my stereotype is that people on the left care about like society, and they care about other people, and they care about fairness, and they care about like things being equal and fair and the rules applying to everyone. And therefore are like, when it comes to the Democrats in Congress, for instance, they followed the rules. Like they were following the rule of law in order to demonstrate their value for the rule of law. Republicans care about power. And because, when you're part of a white supremacist outlook, when your entire agenda is based on the idea that people who are brown or poor or are liberal hippies are a threat, and that their votes and opinions don't really count, or they always cheat, there's some kind of way of, the thing is that you need to have power and hold power by whatever means necessary, as long as it has a veneer of democracy. And when you're up against people who are willing to break the rules, and you're not, you're fighting with one hand behind your back. Trump will be dishonest. He will throw false arguments. He will take things to court and use specious arguments just to take up time, to run out the clock. And so, when I look at Trump especially, and compared to what the Democrats in Congress are doing, yeah, they are living the principles that they want to see enacted. And that puts us at a disadvantage when you have someone who doesn't consider himself bound by those rules or those ethics or those norms. When you're playing fair, you are immediately at a disadvantage against people who are willing to cheat. But to cheat would make us no better than them. If the Democrats just started kind of cheating and using congressional powers and trying to exceed their authorities in ways that matched Trump, how could we say that we're any better? And so that's a big problem. What's the difference between neoliberalism and classical liberalism? Good question. I think, I don't even know for the average person in the street that would even be a question that they would know how to start to answer. Because part of that is a lingo that exists in a very specific corner of the internet. And for your average person in the street, it doesn't really matter. So, but in terms of measurement, yeah, how would you operationalize neoliberalism, and to what extent would it have elements that mapped onto liberalism? And if it did, how would you disambiguate the two concepts? That's a good measurement challenge. I jump in and I immediately hear the phrase sexual fantasies. Yes. I've not seen the Ethan and Ralph tape, by the way, because I don't want to feed into watching revenge porn. I'm aware of it, and Ethan Ralph continues to be scum. Yeah, just sort of like going from scum point to scum point. So, yeah, it seems like most people, generally, the impression is a repudiation. I tried to look into the revenge porn release within like the first 48 hours, and there weren't, normally on those kinds of topics, there are a lot of people making videos, and all of the videos that I saw were just like keck people being crap and talking, like kind of like I'm doing right now. But no, I refuse to watch the tape itself or the video itself, And I don't see anyone defending him. I don't see anyone who said this was a good idea or was a smart thing to do. Generally, he seems to have gotten derided and criticized from all quarters. Now, if there's someone that you know of who actually is like standing up for him, you can drop it in the chat. But in terms of that, no, I don't. I won't watch it. They go low, we go high, just ends with you shooting your own foot. This is why, for me, the election coming up, and I'll get back to the measurement just after this little tangent, is so important. And the other thing that I started to talk about today, and I want to think about in ways that I can talk about this more on my channel, 61% of the American population, just under 62% voted. That means that there's like 28, I can't do math on the fly, almost a third of the population that just sat it out. And we're so busy fighting over the people who do vote. And I know that it's very difficult in these times, it's very difficult to get people to vote for the first time. But there are millions and millions and millions of people who could potentially be voting. And I feel that part of the way we have to win now on the left is to not only is to focus on those groups who are doing the great work of registering people to vote. The work in Florida, I know I made a contribution to the fund that is helping people with felonies pay off their fines so they can regain their right to vote. I know that there is a movement in Georgia called Black Men Vote that I learned about very recently. They registered 50,000 black men to vote in the primary in Georgia. And I think focusing our energies on using the rule of law the way that we can, still, this might be the last time we actually have a fair election if we don't overwhelm. And just be prepared that even if we win overwhelmingly, the RNC and Trump, they're already setting up attorneys to challenge results in any state that uses mail-in ballots that they don't like. He will not, unless he wins, he is going to make a legal attempt to undermine our election no matter what. So but the best way to undercut that is to have an overwhelming turnout, have an overwhelming landslide in key states where it is clear that there's no way that there was any kind of legitimacy to his complaints. All right, I'm getting off the thing. Glad I know nothing about the tape. Yeah, agreed. When they go low, you go hard. Don't give them an inch. Yes. Doesn't mean you go low too, just go at them hard. Yeah, I like that too. I think that's the way. We have to play our game. We have to play our game. We can't always be reacting to and copying their game. And I think that that's kind of what you're getting at there. That we double down on being ethical and good and right and using the system and working within the rule of law. We double down on that. And to their credit, that's what the Democrats in Congress did. And again, it's so fashionable on the left to just crap on Nancy Pelosi and crap on the Democrats. But what we're not doing is giving them credit. They pulled off the fastest impeachment investigation in history. They were very well aware of the election timetable. The Nixon one took like 2 or 3 years to do. The Clinton one took years to do. Mueller, his report, took years to do. And the Democrats got their S together. They lined up witnesses. They had a timetable. They did it first in a protected way to make sure no classified information leaked out. Then they had the redacted things published. And then they had the public hearings so that everybody in America could see for themselves. And they based their articles off of that. And they got it done and kicked over to the Senate. And Trump, the call was in July, I think, July 15th or something. It became knowledge about this time last year, August, right? Congress started its hearings in September, and they were voting on impeachment by January, February. They were having the impeachment hearings in the Senate within 6 months. That is phenomenally fast, and nobody even remembers it anymore. Nobody even cares. Now they're just like, why can't Nancy Pelosi subpoena the U.S. Postal Service and postmaster? Like, when has Trump ever allowed his people to testify. They just challenge subpoenas. He's going to run out the clock. You keep yelling at Pelosi and the Democrats in the House for not acting like Trump. They're not Trump. So instead of yelling at Nancy Pelosi to do something about the Postmaster General, how about you do something? People are protesting outside his house. Are you calling up the Postal Service, like the inspectors? Like, if you are mad about something, don't just yell at the Democrats to do something, because we don't have time between now and November. So if you're mad, do something. Don't boo. Vote, you know? All right, I'm just ranting now. So, Hillary didn't accept it either because writing a book about how you think it was BS is the same thing as threatening legal. I don't know what you're talking about there, Jelly. Sorry. COVID. Okay. People on the left assume that humans are perfect, and if there's an inequality, the system is at fault. Conservatives, on the other hand, have a skeptical view of people. I think that's a main difference. I think people on the left don't think humans are perfect. Maybe they think that they're that if given an equal starting point, way more people would be able to self-actualize and lead better lives if there was a fair playing field. And I think conservatives think that standing on the shoulders of their white privilege, oftentimes their cis male privilege, and their inherited wealth, that they are on a level playing field. I think that would be it. All right, name an example of Trump saying something racist. I'll let you guys in the chat do that, because that's a whole long list. Let's have an example of Trump saying something not racist. All right, so getting back to this, why we measure, because we want to explain the world, we want to understand human behavior. What we measure, that's pretty fuzzy, because it requires us to create some definitions to set things either in a black and white or as some sort of poll, up, left, right, that it makes some assumptions and kind of forces the worldview of political scientists and asks people in the streets to put themselves into our metrics. And then how? Is it a 7-point scale? Is it open-ended that has to be coded? These are all these challenges. So that is just the political scientist perspective on measuring left-right and all of the challenges we face. Then when it comes down to measuring left-right, who we ask the question to may also affect may have an influence on how they answer. So how people understand the question, what people think about. When we ask someone to place themselves on a left-right, or do you consider yourself far left or far right with things in the middle, we're asking them to measure themselves based on their understanding of these poles. So someone from the left, for instance, might think of left-right in terms of laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. Someone else on the left might think about it in terms of the Democratic Party and the Green Party, or the Republican Party and the, whatever else. And so we are hoping that people generally have a kind of similar understanding, so that a 2 from this respondent and a 2 from that respondent are measuring kind of the same thing. But unless we want to say by left we mean, and then give them a paragraph of definitions, and by right we mean, and give them a paragraph of definitions, how many people are actually going to read all that crap and then still respond? So people who are well educated might have a different perspective than someone who hasn't gone through a political science course or whatever else. Someone from a business background might see right as being far more center in terms of a capitalist, So who we ask, what people mean, isn't objective. It's highly subjective. And what we've done a lot of time, at least in the British election study, which I know best, is we now ask respondents to place themselves on a left-right spectrum, and then we ask them to place all the parties on a left-right spectrum. So we can see where they place themselves relative to where they perceive the other party. And that is it's a better insight into how they see the political landscape and where they see themselves fitting into it. It's also more complicated to use that in a regression model than just the simple 5-point left-right scale, right? Because if we got one respondent who says they're centrist, they're in the middle, but they see UKIP and the Conservative Party basically just being center-right, and they see Labour as being extreme left, like completely polar end, right? Then they're actually farther right from our perspective than they are from their own perspective. So who we ask and their understandings makes things fuzzy. When we ask, this is kind of gets back to the point I think somebody else was making, that pre-Brexit, 1970s, when we talked about left-right in the UK, it was really talking about the extent to which you were for unions and for the Labour Party and for a greater role in government. And right was selling off public housing so that people could own their own homes and relieve the taxpayers of the burden of upkeep of public housing, and other free market busting unions, free market stuff. And so left-right was very much framed in terms of an economic dimension. But now that kind of doesn't work anymore. That model has been replaced by other concerns. And we would say now it's more about like national identity and immigration policies and openness and closedness to Britain's role in the world. So it is very difficult to make a convincing argument that you can take a metric of left-right from the 1970s and just take the exact same wording in 2020 and say these two things are measuring the same thing. People in the 1970s had a comparable worldview to what people are saying now, and so we can compare these left-right things. When you ask a question, events will change maybe people's perspectives. You saw in the United States after 9/11 a huge shift rightwards, we would say, toward national security issues. So that's another thing, that's another problem with trying to get that objective metric on a subjective scale. That the subjectivity will slide, but your objective measures don't really capture that. They're always made in reference to the population. And where? What people consider left-right in Canada will be different from what people consider left-right in France and Australia. And I'm just working with English-speaking world now, right? Well, I guess not with France. They don't speak English. But even within the English-speaking world, the political space that people operate in is unique to their politics and where the parties are in those countries. So, if someone is someone like a conservative person in Britain is, they're not interested in expanding gun rights, and they're not interested in making abortion illegal. And so all of the kinds of right-wing issues that we would associate with American politics, that doesn't really apply there. And having a political compass where all you do is just dump questions that were designed either for a single country, or they were designed for a global survey like the World Value Survey, but that was also designed to have question wording that is specific to the country, maybe in the native or the local languages within the context. If I can give you an example about what I mean, about the dangers of just using a Western perspective on a Western perspective and applying it. So the Philippines is a very, very, very Catholic country. Like oppressively so, in my opinion. One of the questions on the World Value Survey asked about partnerships. Like, is it do you approve of people in partnerships? And in the West, the way people read that question was in the light of like same-sex marriage. I'm messing this up a little bit, but let me just give you the context. In the Philippines, people don't have easy access to divorce because of the dominance of the Catholic Church, or at least they didn't at the time these surveys were being given. I don't know if it's gotten any better now. Probably not, but I'm not an expert in the Philippines, so don't quote me on that. People get married and then they get very unhappy in their I think this is the way it went. So people get very unhappy in their marriages. They leave their marriage, but they can't get divorced. So they basically have like an unofficial separation, and then they go and they live with somebody else. Oh, I think it was the question, maybe it was a question on like adultery. Like, do you think adultery is okay? And most places people were saying no, but in the Philippines they were saying yes. And it wasn't because they actually approved of adultery. It's that so many people had lived in these situations. Again, maybe I'm misremembering it. I know I'm getting the thing about the cohabitation thing right. That it was sort of like understood or accepted a bit more that you would just go and find someone you were happy with. That if your marriage wasn't working out, it was a bit more acceptable. And those... And you would just, like, if you looked at the response, it would look really different from the rest of the world. But if you didn't take into account the role of Catholicism and the difficulty of obtaining a divorce, that would just look like a real outlier. So this is why the where the question is asked is very important. And the political compass makes no effort to try to account for where somebody is. How Sargon would appear on a left-right spectrum from American politics would probably be a lot more centrist than he would in a British context, because he has a couple opinions on, like, funding, let's say, the NHS, that American conservatives just wouldn't agree with. Like, they don't see a role for the government in providing healthcare, or the welfare state in other forms. So, all right. So what do you guys would say? When did Trump make a racist statement? Well, okay. I think we could just look it up. Well, we know that Trump has there's a couple things I would point to. That he assumes that people in the suburbs are white. When he talks to suburban housewives and he warns them against these low-income people. I mean, there are still kind of dog whistly parts of it, but he will, I mean, if you're saying, TAZ, that Trump has to say black people are bad in order for him to qualify as racism, then I think you're ignoring the entire evolution of racist dog whistling in the United States since the Southern Strategy. So who was it that said the Southern Strategy statement that back in the 40s you could actually use the N-word? Strategy. But after the Civil Rights Movement, it became, Lee Atwater, wasn't it? His quote. You couldn't say the N-word anymore, so you had to say busing or segregation. Republican strategist Lee Atwater. All right, here we go. The Southern Strategy refers primarily to top-down narratives of the political realignment of the South, which suggested Republican leaders consciously appeal to many white Southerners' racial grievances in order to gain their support. I think if I go back here and just say N-word and busing is it would be boosing. Racism as a campaign strategy. Oh, here's one. You don't need the N-word to know. You think a racial slur is the only way to determine if the president is racist. You haven't been paying attention. And you don't understand what racism means. Trump saying the N-word. This was back when people have heard him say the N-word. His niece Mary have heard him say racial slurs, including the N-word and anti-Semitic slurs. So Trump is a racist. That doesn't hinge on whether he uttered one particular epithet. I can't say that word. No matter how ugly it is. It's about the totality of his presidency, and after 18 months you see his racial animus throughout his policy initiatives, whether you hear it on tape or not. Over the course of his career, well before he took office, Trump's antipathy towards people of color has been plainly evident. In the 1970s, his real estate company was subject to a federal investigation that found his employees had secretly marked the paperwork of minority apartment rental applicants with codes such as C for colored. After Black and Latino teenagers were charged with sexually assaulting a white woman, he took out full-page ads in the New York City newspapers calling for the return of the death penalty. He never backtracked or apologized when those convictions were overturned. He championed birtherism, and he is again. As his president, he targeted African-American athletes for criticism, whether it's ranting, "Get that son of a bitch off the field," or saying LeBron James was just interviewed by the dumbest man on television, Don Lemon. He made LeBron look smart, which is easy to do. Calling African-American Representative Maxine Waters a low IQ person is now a routine part of his rallies. He was quoted referring to Haiti, El Salvador, and various African nations as S-hole countries. He announced in his campaign by referring to Mexican immigrants as rapists. Yeah, the fact is that he never goes after, he always has racial stereotypes that he associates with people of color. And also, I mean, look at the way that he kind of goes after Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. So there's nothing in Trump's history or background to indicate that he has, if a person of color agrees with him, is useful to him, and is willing to be a puppet or a tool, he will say nice things about that person. But in terms of groups of people, he has a deep amount of animus. All right. I think I'm going to blaze through. What time is it? I thought I'd been going about an hour. I think what I want to do now is get back to the topic and look a little bit at metrics and measurement, and then we're going to end, I think probably, I say half an hour, but you know me, I end up like running my mouth all too long. Okay, and so I've got 3 articles that I have picked out for you guys that I want to look at because I think that they help illustrate the point about the problems with the political compass, but also why it's not easy to just create an alternative political compass that would be more accurate. It's because measuring things is hard. Yeah, I think, with just one last thing on Trump and racism. If you take out all of the people like Ben Carson and Herman Cain and Omarosa and Diamond and Silk, if you take out all people who come from a minority ethnic background, who weren't useful or helpful or beneficial or willing to promote him, how many people who are of a minority ethnic background has he ever said anything nice about? It should, if people do good things, you should be able to praise them and honor them. But it seems like with Trump, the only people of color that he is willing to praise are the ones who are directly benefiting him. And so that to me indicates that he is deeply racist, and that he will make exceptions for individuals, kind of in the same way, like Candace Owens is willing to say a lot of things that go against what the majority of black people feel, and so she is put up on a platform, just like Dinesh D'Souza, in order to attack those people so that white people can point to her and say, oh, I'm not saying these things, it's Candace, and of course she's also comes from this community, or Dinesh also comes from this community, and so you can't criticize them or question them because of their skin color or their background. So they want to use that kind of racial politics or identity politics in order to undermine the views of a lot of people with just 1 or 2 people. That's how I see it. All right. This is from Matthew Smith, lead data journalist at YouGov, and it was published last August. Oh my gosh, like almost a year ago. Just over a year and 2 days ago. I am going to... All right. And this was leading up to was the election last year? Oh, man. Oh, wow, yeah. God, it just feels like so much has happened since then. This time last year, they were talking about a general election. Oh, man. That's crazy. All right. A new angle of attack from Jeremy Corbyn seems to be that Boris Johnson is presiding over the most right-wing government in living memory. That might be a helpful move if politicians had an accurate assessment of where the public stands on the left-right spectrum. But if the reaction in Westminster to YouGov survey data from earlier this week, showing that 75% of Brits, including 61% of Labour voters, support the PM's proposed expansion of stop and search powers as anything to go by, they may well not. Framing politics in terms of left and right wing might seem simple for politicians and comforting for activists, but it seems that these terms just aren't that useful for talking about, or indeed to, the general public. A new YouGov study reveals that the political wing spectrum is poorly understood, and also that huge numbers of people don't hold consistent left and right outlooks. These are all the things like who, what, where, when, why, how. Please note, all of this is before even getting into the argument about whether the left and right-wing scale should be accompanied by an authoritarian libertarian axis. The data explored below is all public opinion. Regarding each policy we tested, YouGov has made no declaration that any given policy is left-wing, right-wing, or otherwise. At most, only half of the people surveyed know what is a left-wing policy and what is a right-wing policy. For those who spend their days immersed in Westminster goings-on, awareness of how the left-right spectrum works is taken for granted. But our results show that the wider public, in fact, is largely unfamiliar with the categorization. Of the more than 100 political views we put to people, none were identified as being specifically left-wing or right-wing by more than 53% of the people. So again, when we get back to that point about somehow the spectrum needing to expand or contract based on the politics, if people don't think in that way, they just work within the context of what they understand at the time. All right. That is to say, even for the most stereotypically left and right-wing policies, half of the population do not identify them as such. The political view that most Britons identify as being left-wing is believing that the minimum wage in the UK is too low. Around half, 53% of people, said it was a left-wing view, while 13% said it was neither, and 7% thought it was right-wing. The remaining 26% answered, don't know. So this is these are the top 10 most recognizably left-wing views. In other words, this is where you get the majority of people. If you asked a question and said, does this policy indicate a right-wing or a left-wing point of view? Yeah, please say whether you believe it is a left-wing or right-wing view. And even then, for me, these questions would be so obvious because I am a political scientist and I've been brought up in a way to think about these in terms of spectrums and metrics and measures, but most people don't. So the most left-wing, the popular left-wing thing is believing the minimum wage in the UK is too low. Next is believing trade unions to be a force for good. Believing there should be more government redistribution of income from the better off to the less well off. 4% of people thought that was a right-wing view. 30% people didn't know, and 15% it said it was neither. Supporting the introduction of a wealth tax for the wealthiest people in society. So again, 7% of people thought that was a right-wing view. Opposing the UK having nuclear weapons. Not even half of the people thought that was a left-wing view. Believing the level of welfare benefits is too low. Again, only half of people responding thought that was a left-wing view. 5% thought it was a right-wing view. Opposing creating more grammar schools and that select pupils by ability. 12% thought that was a right-wing view. Opposing Britain having a monarchy. Less than half thought that was a left-wing view. Supporting the nationalization of utilities, such as electricity and gas. 13% thought that was a right-wing view. And supporting the nationalization of the railways, only 47%. So, yeah, that kind of getting back to my point about how hard it is for us to, I mean, these things are useful and they're good to know, but how we think about them and use them isn't, we have to be cautious and reflective. On the other end of the spectrum, the most identified right-wing view was believing the levels of welfare benefits in the UK is too high. Again, around half of Britons say this is a right-wing view, while 31% don't know, 13% it's neither, and 4% think it's a left-wing view. Let's have a look at this one in the big C's then. So yes, first we got the, no! There we go. Believing the welfare benefits too high, 52% thought that was right-wing. Believing the NHS would be improved by more private sector involvement, 9% thought that was a left-wing view. 51%, I mean, it's 52%, 51%, it's pretty close. Wanting there to be tighter restrictions on immigration, that, again, ties, but still 8% thought it was a left-wing view. believing trade unions are a force for bad. About 51% thought that was right-wing. Supporting creating more grammar schools. We've got that. Believing the criminal justice system is too soft is believed by almost half to be a right-wing view. Believing discipline in schools is not strict enough. Again, less than half thought that was a right-wing view. Believing there should be less government redistribution of income. 13% thought that was a left-wing view. Crazy. 45% thought it was right-wing. Opposing free tuition at universities for students. 45%. And supporting the UK having nuclear weapons. It was the lowest at 44%. So, again, yes, I accept your terms. Okay. When it comes to the view that Britons are most likely to describe themselves as neither left-wing nor right-wing, the top two are supporting euthanasia and believing the internet and social media play a negative role in modern society. What views do left and right-wing people hold? If asking people whether something is left or right-wing is not so helpful, then perhaps looking at what left and right-wing people hold, the views they hold, might be more instructive. According to YouGov profiles, 28% of Britons describe themselves as left-wing, 25% consider themselves right-wing, 19% place themselves in the center, and the remaining 29% don't know. The most popular answer is I don't know. Which is fair enough. A lot of people don't pay attention to politics. Who's leaving? Good night, someone. Bye. All right, so let's see here. The most commonly held view among all left-wingers, 92%, is that converting to green and renewable energy sources should be a priority. And this view is also held, of course, by 78% of right-wingers. The most closely bipartisan view held by the largest number of people is that doctors should have the legal power to end the life of terminally ill patients who have been given a clear indication that they wish to die. 83% of left-wingers and 82% of right-wingers all agree on that issue. The most commonly held view amongst right-wingers is at 86% that the global population growth is a problem. This view is also held by 78% of left-wingers. The view that right-wingers are the most likely to hold compared to left-wingers is that Britain should leave the EU, which of course is a very ephemeral issue. In 5 years, that one won't be as salient. So this also reflects the when the question was asked. Okay, so I guess we'll just move on to this next chart since I've already gone here. It looks like they're looking at the distance between political views that most differentiate left and right wingers. So if we wanted to say if we wanted to create a whole new scale of left and right, what would we go for? And maybe what would make sense is instead of coming up with libertarian authoritarianism or laissez-faire versus socialism, is to actually ask people and then find the questions on which the left and right differ most. The problem with that is it might just be a hodgepodge of issues that don't have an ideological coherency to them. And in which case, it's a little bit more difficult to say left and right is an ideological position, which is what we tend to think about when we think about parties and left and right. So leaving the EU there's a lot of distance. Having nukes, immigration, multiculturalism, and political correctness. To me, this isn't so much ideologically, conceptually together. They are just the issues from 2019 that were the most polarizing and in the news. That makes sense. Like, people were the most different on leaving the EU because they were just about to have a general election that dealt with Brexit. And so that's where you saw the left and right differences, but what can you really say about them other than they're a reflection of the partisan divide that was happening? Next, the NHS would be proved by less private sector involvement. Okay, then you've got, I guess that would be a capitalism or a laissez-faire versus socialism dimension. Remaining in the EU, again, multiculturalism. This is an isolationist versus cosmopolitan worldview. Having nukes and thinking the trade unions are a force for good. So you basically have two economic measures, international policy, and on nukes, is nukes like an environmental issue? Is it environmentalism versus national security? I don't know. Okay. Let's see, what's the next chart? what right-wing views, what right-wing views are people who consider themselves left-wing most likely to hold? They want to see school discipline be stricter. Those kids. I don't know. I think this might be part of the generation that grew up with caning and still think that beating people for some reason is weird. The criminal justice system is too soft. So both of those metrics about school discipline and criminal justice would kind of come down on the authoritarian side of things. Supporting nuclear energy. Want more restrictions on immigration. Favor a powerful government over individual freedoms. Again, that's authoritarianism. So that one is basically, that wording looks a little bit dodgy. What the question usually says is, if you had a choice between putting more emphasis on people's liberties or on government security, which would you choose? And then getting people to say, oh, I will give up some of my liberties for more security versus risk my security to enjoy my liberties. Supporting capital punishment, opposing political correctness, which supporting having nuclear weapons, opposing positive discrimination, that's what they call affirmative action, for people from ethnic minorities, support opening more grammar schools, and think the focus on prisons should be more on punishment. So yes, that's what we say right-wing views on an authoritarian libertarian scale, as well as less on economics. It's mostly wanting to crack down on people. So the left has, from this, some sympathy for what we would consider more authoritarian tendencies, and also obviously immigration, some xenophobia. Now, what left-wing views are people in Britain who consider themselves right-wing most likely to hold? Think that the House of Lords should be elected. Think the government should play a dominant role in managing the economy. Think the minimum wage is too low. Support railway nationalization. Prefer an isolationist foreign policy. I guess the right wing is considered with open trade and openness. So I guess that's probably where that dimension is coming from. Support utilities nationalization. Believe the UK has a responsibility to help poorer nations financially. Support cannabis decriminalization. Support positive gender discrimination. This is interesting because you saw the last one about positive discrimination for people from ethnic minorities. I know from the British election study, there are two metrics on support for, like, basically it's like a feminism patriarchy, you want to say, metric, and the other one is like tolerance for minorities. And one of the questions in each of those scales is efforts to have more fill in the blank women, or BME, but they'd say BMAE now, members of parliament, haven't gone far enough, are about right, and have gone too far. It might be a 5-point scale, but it's basically like, have we done enough to get better representation? And it's interesting here, from my point of view, knowing those scales, to see that left-wingers, if you want to talk about them having a right-wing point of view, it's on racial, that they are posing more efforts to be diverse. So left-wing kind of racists, or left-wing people who don't value diversity or inclusion. And then here on the right, they're willing to, like, so we would associate people who are right-wing with, like, thinking women's place is in the home, and because that's the stereotype of where it falls ideologically. But here they've got support for women. So I don't know where they are in the ethnic minority groups, but in terms of actually saying, yeah, we could do more to help women, that seems to be a counterintuitive view that some right-wingers, if by our metrics, would have. And then support more redistribution. So let's see here. Other than the House of Lords, which I think is a kind of a weird one, it's a bit of an outlier because it's a procedural type of thing. It's not economic or government. It's about democracy, really. But here we've got government being in the economy, government being in the economy, government running the economy, nationalizing utility being in the economy, the government giving money to poor countries, and in supporting the redistribution of wealth. So it seems that there is I know I saw another survey recently that showed that people who vote for the conservatives are actually far closer to the center than the policies of the conservatives when you rank them according to a left-right scale. Supporting women is more anti-trans from the right. I don't really know that kind of that you can get that from 2019 data. Supporting women is more anti-trans from the right. I think, the way we'd have to look at the way the question, because it's positive gender discrimination. So what they're talking about, policies that help push women who are or basically helping to recruit and push forward women who otherwise might not get. So the other thing here is this positive discrimination. I don't know if they mean in parliament or if they mean in companies. So I don't think you can go from the anti-trans and make that jump from this 2019 data, just because I know the wording of that question, and it generally has to do with, should companies adopt policies that do positive discrimination for women? Or should political parties, have they done enough to get women representation? So it's not a cis-trans issue. Just to say, I don't think that that's what that question is picking up on. The survey is trash. Well, the survey is just, they're asking people what their positions are. So I don't know why you're saying it's trash, Emma. They're not actually trying to say this is left or right. They're pointing out that when you ask these opinion questions, people don't neatly fit into a left-right spectrum. That's the whole point of the article. So in case you didn't catch that before, that's what this is about. All right, so then they're triangulating people's responses in terms of sharing. So let's see. If the view is held by a majority, a plurality, or a tie. Well, let's see what this is. Commonly held right-wing views. Again, people don't think of themselves necessarily as a right-wing view. It's an opinion they have, but according to a traditional metric, we would call them, political scientists would call them right-wing. Among people who hold various left-wing views. And they say YouGov has not made a judgment over whether a given policy is left or right-wing. These are shown that all views that the public consider to be left or right-wing. So if you think that the criminal justice system is too soft, you are also likely to say you want to see a greater redistribution of wealth. If you think that the school discipline should be stricter, and go here, you're also likely to hold these views. So what they're basically saying is they're triangulating the positives on here and showing that there's a lot of, we say, correlation between views that we think people should be opposite on. And they're just kind of linking up here, like wanting tighter restriction on immigration, let's see, and opposing the monarchy. I don't know if this chart's very useful, but it might just be interesting from a point of view of, let's see, opposing positive discrimination for people from ethnic minorities. And then looking at that, I think, so for instance, 61% of people who supported a wealth tax also support capital punishment. All right, we're just going to move on. This seems like a really complicated table to interpret, and I don't have time for that. So, and then they do the same thing for commonly held left-wing views among people who hold various right-wing views. Let's see if there's anything particularly interesting here. I don't know. I don't think so. All right, so it's a mishmash. It's difficult. It's hard to. From a political scientist's point of view, it's best for us if we can make the world very simple and have things in easy steps and measure, like age in years is a very nice interval level measure because we know what a year is and we know what it means to get a year older and we can see those effects and estimate them. But people are complicated. All right, so getting on with the people are complicated, I wanted to look at this post from actually someone I know, Nick Barlow. We follow each other on Twitter, and I wanted to, oh, come on, what are you doing? Okay, there we go. Just, Nick is I think still a PhD student at Queen Mary, was it? I think that's what it said. Let's look. All right, let's not. Okay, yes. Queen Mary University, London, yes. All right. So I'll just read out from Nick's article. One thing I heard a few times at Liberal Democrat conference was an assertion along the lines of, most people are centrist, therefore they'll want to join us and vote for us if we just give them a chance. This is normally backed by some recent polling that has shown people are generally centrist and an earnest belief along the lines that they just need to be told the right words and then they'll realize they are just like us. This is a belief I like to call the centrist fallacy because it rests on a number of assumptions about people, political behavior, and political parties that don't apply in practice, even if some of them appear to have a basis in fact. Let me take you through some of the data in an effort to show you why. Now, I know we're dealing a lot with British data and British perspective, and that's because that's what I know, but you can really easily imagine how this could be transferable to Canada or the United States or other English-speaking countries, or probably any country in the world. Things are way more complicated than they appear, but I thought this was good because centrist tends to be a dirty word in left-wing Twitter and left-wing YouTube. And as a consequence, I wanted to kind of look at this from the perspective of people who actually find the idea of centrism a bit more attractive. So I thought that was, and then there's also some good data in here. So first, most people are centrist does actually have some basis. In fact, let's take a look at the most recent British election study data, which is generally recent. It has a large sample size, and most importantly, for my purposes, is free and to use and easy to obtain. It asks respondents the question, in politics, people sometimes talk of left and right. Where would you place yourself on the following scale, with a scale that runs from 0 left to 10 right? And when we combine all the responses, we get the following graph. And yes, there is a peak in the centrist position. 21.7% of people who give an answer put themselves at the dead center, position 5, with another 9.1 and 9.7 positions 4 and 6, which means we can probably fairly say around 40% of the electorate see themselves as some form of centrist. For clarity, I've only included those who gave a definitive answer. Just over 5,000 people, 16% of the total survey, gave a don't know answer. So he's saying he's excluded those. The problem, however, with relying on this as some proof on an unmet demand for centrism is that merely asking people to place themselves on a scale isn't doing any questioning of their actual political views. If you're reading this post, then it's highly likely that you're an anomaly, or at least above average for the UK in how much you think about politics. Most people spend very little time thinking about politics, or how they'd classify their own views on a left-right scale. So when they're going to place themselves on a scale like that, they're quite often going to plump for something near the center, either because it's a good way of answering without committing to anything, or because most people like to think of themselves as being generally moderate. Lucky for us, though, the BES asks people a lot more questions than that. I'm writing this post quickly, so I haven't had time to properly wait and organize the data, so disclaimers ahead. First off, there's how people vote. The raw unweighted data in the BES gives us the following. Conservatives 32.6%, Labour 27.1%, Lib Dem 7%, yada yada yada. Now let's look at the same voting question for those we claim as some kind of centrist, scoring themselves at 4, 5, or 6 on the left-right spectrum. Conservatives 32.6%, Labour 19.9%, Liberal Democrats 10%, UKIP 3.4%. So, self-positioned centrists are slightly more likely to vote Liberal Democrat, SNP, or Plaid Cymru, but not excessively so. And they're also more likely to answer don't know when asked how to vote. They'll vote. And if anything, the figure in there makes me want to delve deeper into examine is the drop in labor support rather than anything else. The BES does allow us to look in a bit more depth at what people actually believe rather than just relying on their self-placement for that. There are a number of questions on people's opinions of things, which include a set of 10 questions that work quite well for finding positions on 2 dimensions of the political map. There are 5 traditional left-right questions asking respondents how much they agree or disagree with the following statements. Government should redistribute income from the better off to those who are less well off. Big business takes advantage of ordinary people. Ordinary people do not get their fair share of the nation's wealth. There is one law for the rich and one for the poor. Management will always try to get the better of employees if it gets the chance. And 5 questions on a libertarian authoritarian scale. Young people today don't have enough respect for traditional British values. For some crimes, the death penalty is the most appropriate sentence. Schools should teach children to obey authority. Censorship of films and magazines is necessary to uphold moral standards. and people who break the law should be given stiffer sentences. The answer to all 10 are on a 5-point Likert scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree, and by combining the two sets of scales, we can give every respondent a score from 0 to 10 on a both left, right, libertarian, authoritarian scale. So someone answering neither agree nor disagree to all 5 questions would end up scoring a 5, or a 0 would indicate full left or a libertarian position, and a 10 a full right or authoritarian one. This is how the population as a whole lines up on the authoritarian-libertarian axis. Remember, 0 is the most libertarian, 10 the most authoritarian. Now, people tend to skew authoritarian, right? And on the left-right scale, where 0 is left and 10 is right. On both graphs, the blue bars are the actual numbers of respondents at that point. The black line is an indication of a normal distribution, so it's skewing. So in the middle value, from the middle value, it's not dead in the center. In both cases, we can see the population as a whole isn't arranged around what we might think is a moderate position. Voters' views tend toward the authoritarian and the left sides rather than clustering around the middle. So what we can already see is that despite people's self-description of themselves as politically clustering around the middle, their actual political views don't. So how do our centrists compare with the rest of the population on these values? Like so. And here's just the 4, 5s, and 6s, I assume, who also scale toward authoritarianism, and they also skew left. If anything, self-described centrists are slightly more authoritarian than the population as a whole, and very marginally more left-wing. And for those of you who want to delve into the data, I've posted the crosstabs as an Excel spreadsheet. Another example of how relevant this post is to look at people who have liberal views and see how they identify themselves, specifically in terms of the Liberal Democrat appeal to voters, which emphasizes the party's liberalism. It's there in the name, after all. Are people with liberal values likely to see themselves as centrist? Taking liberal as anyone with a score of 4 or less on the liberal authoritarian scale and looking at how they identify themselves on the left-right scale, we find that on average they place themselves at 3.13. Yes. Almost half going for 2 or 3, nearly 2/3 volunteering positions of less than 3. This also appears on their views of left-right. So this post has been a quick and dirty, but I need to go into more depth some of the figures in future. But there are a few points that are useful in assessing any claims of the lots of people are centrists, and therefore lots of people will vote for us if we say we're centrists. 1. Centrist means different things to different people, and just because someone puts themselves in the middle doesn't mean they agree with you when they claim to be there too, when you claim to be in the middle too. People who think of themselves as being in the center have views that tend away from the moderate and toward the economic left and the authoritarian right. These views are effective center views in Britain, but they're not really at the center of the political debate, and in conjunction they tend to be most unrepresented, and people with liberal views tend to see themselves as being on the left and to have more left-wing economic views. They do not tend to see themselves as centrists and are somewhat outside the mainstream opinion. All of these are tentative, but I need to work with the data, yada, yada, yada. So thank you very much, Nick, for that real-world practical application and how people in political parties tend to have in all political parties, we have the same fallacy that we're not thinking about people and politics in the same way that non-partisans and non-activists don't. If anyone is interested, I'm going to wrap up the show now. I'm getting tired. I haven't taken a break. It's been an hour and 40 minutes. That seems like enough for this week. I also have this article here, relationship between explanation and prediction. Talked a little bit about basically for the purposes of statistical modeling, and in the sciences, we tend to treat prediction as a good. Some people tend to treat prediction as some kind of equivalent of explanation. There are other people who think of explanation and prediction as being very different, and then there are philosophers who agonize over these questions. So what I can do here is I will go ahead and I will retweet everything that I've used in the show. If you're following me on the Twitters, you can go ahead and find those on my in my timeline. So, we'll just have a look. Dave Rubin thinks he's a centrist. Yeah, what people call themselves has no bearing necessarily on the political reality. And there are people who call themselves centrist because it is convenient in a partisan way, not because they actually want to be truth tellers. So, lobster. Okay, that's fine. Oh, there's a happy hour. I didn't mention it. Well, Kevin and I are going to do a happy hour right after this. I'm going to set it up for 8 o'clock this evening. I have no idea what we're going to talk about. All I know is that we talked about doing a show on Sunday. One of the things we will probably talk about is Mythicist Milwaukee. Check their timeline, see how many. They had 100 tickets for sale, and it looks like they couldn't even move 100 because they were still selling tickets this morning. They never got to that sold out part of the event. We'll have a look at that. Also, there was some drama with Karlene Borszewski or whatever her name is. Sorry, I'm from a Polish background and I also can't even remember her name. But she had some drama with a hotel in, looks like Pewaukee, in Waukesha County. And we'll look at her reasoning for why she got thrown out of a hotel. And then why I don't think her explanation is plausible based on the evidence of what I know about that county. All right, so hopefully I will see you all back here on my channel in like 6 hours or so, a little more than 6 hours. Until next Sunday, guys, I've been Christy. Y'all have been awesome. Thank you. Sorry I didn't really pay too much attention to the chat. I had a lot of stuff to deliver, but maybe next week we can look into a PragerU video or debunk some Sargon or Tim Pool or something along those lines. So yeah, I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Have a great rest of your day, and hopefully see you in a few hours' time. Thanks for everyone for stopping by. Bye-bye.